Adam, a middle-aged taxi driver, after a long day of work, was rushing home to have dinner with his wife. As an annual tradition on this day, they still celebrated their deceased daughter's birthday to remind them to always remember her, and that she was always present in their lives. This made him want to return home even sooner. To get home faster, Adam chose to take an old deserted road through the forest, where the road was difficult and few people passed by. He had no idea that this decision would change his life forever. Adam squinted through the windshield, the dim streetlights barely cutting through the thickening fog that curled around the quiet road. It was late, far too late for anyone to be out. He decided to take a shortcut through the forest to get home. The weight of the day still pressed heavily on his shoulders. As he rounded a bend, his headlights suddenly caught the blur of something darting across the road. Instinct kicked in. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he slammed the brakes hard. The car screeched to a halt, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. His heart pounded in his chest as the car came to a stop, just inches from the figure. Adam exhaled shakily, his eyes wide. What the hell? He unclipped his seatbelt and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. His eyes scanned the road, then froze. Standing just a few feet away, illuminated in the weak glow of the headlights, was a small girl. She was thin, dangerously so, with tangled hair that hung limply around her face. Her clothes were wrinkled and ill-fitting, as though they hadn't been washed in days. She stared at him with wide, hollow eyes. "You all right?" Adam called out, still shaken. His voice echoed in the eerie quiet of the road. The girl didn't respond. She just stood there, her small frame barely moving. Adam hesitated, glancing around. The road was deserted. No cars, no houses in sight. His discomfort deepened. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, unsettling. But then his thoughts drifted to his own daughter, the same age as this girl. He knew that his daughter would really want him to help this girl. The thought of leaving this child out here in the dark gnawed at him. He approached slowly, hands out to show he meant no harm. "Hey, what's your name?" The girl blinked, her lips parting slightly. "Vivien." Her voice was faint, almost a whisper, and yet there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of Adam's neck stand on end. "What are you doing out here, Vivien?" It's late, still no real answer. She just shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clutching something in her small hands. A worn, stuffed rabbit. She glanced back at the road, her eyes darting nervously. "Do you need help?" Adam asked, uncertain. "Where's your family?" "My mum is waiting for me at home." Her words were clipped, direct, but there was an edge to her tone. It was as if she wanted to say more, but held herself back. Adam glanced down the empty road again, his gut instinct screaming that something wasn't right. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, hop in. I'll give you a ride home." Vivien hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word, her small form barely visible in the oversized seatbelt. Adam followed, his mind racing with questions. As he started the car and pulled back onto the road, he shot a glance at her. She sat stiffly, eyes straight ahead, saying nothing. The silence grew thick, palpable, and Adam, feeling the weight of it, attempted to break the tension. "So, Vivien, where's home? You sure your mum's waiting for you?" She nodded but gave no further explanation. "Do you live nearby?" Another nod. Adam's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel, unsure whether to press for more or leave her be. Something about her silence made him uneasy. "Vivien?" Adam probed gently, but she remained distant, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the stuffed rabbit's worn fur. "Just follow the road," she finally said, her voice almost mechanical. "It's not far." Adam nodded, swallowing the growing tension in his throat. The drive stretched out longer than expected, the road narrowing as they went. His unease deepened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that turning back wasn't an option. "Are you sure your mum's waiting?" he asked again, his tone soft but urgent. Vivien didn't answer, her lips pressed into a thin line as the night thickened around them. Adam drove slowly, the tires of his old pickup kicking up loose gravel as the road became increasingly unfamiliar. The trees seemed to close in, thickening into a dense wall on either side, blotting out what little daylight remained. He glanced into the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Vivien, her small frame wrapped in her oversized coat, eyes fixed on something beyond the window. Her silence had been unsettling since they'd left town, and now it was beginning to weigh on him. This part of the road was never this eerie, he thought. He'd driven through these woods dozens of times before, yet nothing looked the same. No familiar houses, no passing cars. Even the landmarks he'd used to navigate seemed to have vanished into the thick shadows of the towering pines. Anxiety gnawed at his chest, and every few minutes he would steal a glance at Vivien, but her expression remained unreadable, cold even. It was as if she were a stranger, not the little girl he had known. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Adam finally asked, breaking the silence that had grown unbearable. His voice was low, cautious. Vivien didn't immediately respond. She continued to stare into the trees, her small hands resting in her lap, fingers twitching slightly. Finally she spoke, her tone flat and emotionless. "Yes, it's just a little farther." There was something unnerving about the way she said it, a certainty that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The trees seemed to grow darker, the air colder, as they pushed deeper into the woods. Adam's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the narrowing road ahead for any sign of life. But there was nothing, just the darkening forest and the winding, lonely path that stretched out in front of them. After a few more minutes of silence, Vivien suddenly leaned forward. "Stop here," she said, her voice startling him out of his thoughts. Adam blinked, confused. They were in the middle of nowhere, no houses, no signposts, nothing but trees for miles around. "Here? You want me to stop here?" He couldn't hide the disbelief in his voice. "Yes," she said firmly, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. "This is where I need to get out." Adam hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake. "But there's nothing here, Vivien. It's just trees. Are you sure this is the right place?" "My mother is waiting for me," she said, her gaze unblinking, her voice unnervingly calm. "In the forest." His heart skipped a beat. "Your mother?" The words felt heavy in his mouth. "Vivien, your mother isn't here. We should go back. Maybe—" "No," she cut him off, her voice suddenly sharp. "She's here. She is waiting for me." Adam stared at the road ahead. The idea of leaving Vivien alone in the middle of this desolate place was unthinkable. He shifted uneasily in his seat, debating whether to refuse her request or trust her strange insistence. But the look on her face left him no room for argument. He sighed, his hand trembling slightly as he shifted the truck into park. "All right," he said quietly, glancing back at her once more. "But are you sure? I can't just leave you out here." Vivien opened the door, stepping out onto the dirt road. The wind rustled the branches overhead, sending a chill through the air. Then, without a word, she turned and began walking towards the tree line, her small figure quickly swallowed by the shadows of the forest. Adam watched her go, an uneasy knot forming in his stomach. He leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tightly, fighting the urge to call her back. But he didn't. Something about the way she moved, so calm, so certain, made him feel powerless. As her figure disappeared into the trees, the road fell silent again, leaving Adam alone with his thoughts. The strange encounter gnawed at him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something he couldn't understand. His curiosity and the lingering sense of responsibility made him stay longer than he should have. His breath fogged the windshield as he stared into the darkening forest. Should he just drive away? Leave her to her business? But the image of her wandering through the woods, small and vulnerable, tugged at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. With a reluctant sigh, he stepped out of the car. The forest loomed ahead, shadows shifting between the trees as if inviting him in. He hesitated for a moment, but then quietly shut the door and followed her, careful to stay far enough behind so as not to alert her. The sound of dry leaves crunching beneath his shoes made him flinch. He slowed his pace, trying to blend with the stillness around him. Vivien moved through the underbrush with a strange confidence, like she had done this countless times before. Her small figure darted through the trees, slipping between narrow paths without hesitation. Adam's heart raced as he kept his distance, his mind swirling with questions. How often had she done this? And why here, of all places? As the light faded, he realized they had been walking for longer than he anticipated. The trees thickened, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The deeper they ventured, the more isolated the world seemed. The sound of the distant highway faded, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. Adam squinted through the gloom, barely able to make out Vivien's figure ahead. She turned off the path, stepping into a clearing, and there it was, a house. Not just any house. A dilapidated, sagging structure, its wooden boards warped and grey from years of abandonment. The roof was partially collapsed, and vines crept along the walls as though trying to swallow the building whole. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Adam froze. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn back and pretend he hadn't seen any of this. But his feet stayed planted, and his eyes followed Vivien as she made her way toward the house. She moved with eerie certainty, not hesitating for a moment as she approached the door, pushed it open, and disappeared inside. For a long moment, Adam stood in the clearing, his breath shallow. What on earth was she doing here? And why did she seem so familiar with this place? Unable to resist, he crept forward, every step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the side of the house, he pressed himself against the wall, peeking into one of the cracked windows. Inside, dim light filtered through broken shutters, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. His gaze landed on Vivien, who stood before an old wooden chair. Someone was sitting in it. Adam's breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A woman, her back to him, sat motionless in the chair. Vivien was speaking softly to her, the words too muffled to make out. But something was wrong. The woman didn't move, didn't respond, just sat there, rigid, like a statue. A sickening chill ran down Adam's spine. He pressed closer to the window, squinting through the grime. The woman was pale, unnaturally so. Her skin was waxy, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if someone had placed them there. It hit him all at once. She wasn't alive. His stomach lurched. He stepped back from the window, his heart hammering in his chest. What was going on here? Who was that woman? And why was Vivien talking to her like nothing was out of the ordinary? Adam's mind raced, but he didn't have time to think. Vivien turned her head slightly, as if sensing something outside. Adam ducked, his back pressing hard against the rough wood of the house, his breath shallow and fast. He couldn't let her know he was there. Not yet. He needed to figure out what was happening. The air in the small cabin was thick with decay, a cloying, unbearable stench that made Adam's breath hitch in his throat. His hand hovered at the door, unsure whether to enter. The dim light barely filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows over the rotting wood floor. He hadn't been inside the place for more than a minute, yet everything inside screamed that something was horribly wrong. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, the reality of the scene started to piece itself together like a grotesque puzzle. There, lying motionless on the old, sagging bed, was the body of a woman who had been dead for days, maybe even longer. His stomach turned as he noticed the discoloration on her skin, the unmistakable signs of decomposition setting in. And then there was Vivien. She sat beside her mother's body, brushing her matted hair as though nothing had changed. Her face, pale and strained, bore the marks of sleepless nights, yet her eyes still flickered with a childlike determination. She was talking softly, as if to coax her mother back to health. "She's just been tired, Adam." Vivien's voice was soft, almost detached. "I've been taking care of her. She'll wake up soon. I just know it." Adam felt a cold sweat run down his spine. He didn't know how to respond, his thoughts scrambling to find something to say that wouldn't shatter her fragile world. His mind screamed at him to get out, to run, but his heart knew he couldn't leave her alone like this. "Vivien," he began slowly, stepping closer. His voice felt distant, like it wasn't his own. "You've been here. How long?" "I don't know," she replied with a small smile. "I've been doing everything she needs, feeding her, cleaning her. But she's so tired, you see. I think if I keep trying, she'll be fine." Her words fell heavy in the air, laced with denial so thick that Adam could barely breathe through it. He took another step forward, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Vivien, your mother." "I know," she interrupted, her tone almost cheerful, though her eyes had begun to fill with tears. "She's really sick, but I've seen worse. She just needs rest. I can help her." Adam's heart ached at her innocence, her blind hope. He knelt down beside her, feeling the weight of the situation settle like a leaden cloud over him. He didn't know how to say it. How could he tell a girl that the one person she loved most in the world was never coming back? "She's not resting," Adam whispered, his voice cracking. Vivien, she's gone." The smile on Vivien's face faltered for a moment, confusion flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean? She's right here. She's just asleep." "No," he said, more firmly now, gripping her shoulders gently. "She's not asleep. She's not going to wake up. Your mother, she's dead." There was a long, terrible silence. Vivien blinked, her smile fading entirely now, as if she couldn't understand the words. Her small body tensed, and then the tears began to spill down her cheeks. "You're wrong!" she cried, pulling away from him. "She's just sick. You don't know anything." Adam stood up, feeling the rising tide of panic in his own chest. This was worse than he had imagined. Vivien was slipping into a world where reality no longer touched her. He had to do something. "Vivien, listen to me," he said as calmly as he could, though his voice shook. "I'm going to take you away from here. We need to get help." "No!" she screamed, backing away from him toward her mother's body. "I'm not leaving her. I'm not." "I know this is hard," Adam whispered, stepping forward again, "but we can't stay here. I need to get you somewhere safe." For a moment, she hesitated, glancing between her mother and him. The conflict in her eyes tore at him. She wanted to believe her mother was still alive. She needed to believe it. but deep down he could see a flicker of doubt creeping in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. Her small hand reached for his, trembling, and he squeezed it gently. Without another word, they stepped out of the cabin and into the forest. The air outside felt clean, sharp against his skin, as though it, too, was trying to cleanse them of the horror they were leaving behind. But the weight of what had happened inside that cabin clung to them both, an unshakable truth they would carry long after the woods were far behind. Adam's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as they neared the town's government building. His eyes flickered towards Vivien, who sat silently in the passenger seat, her eyes blank, staring out the window at the passing scenery. She hadn't spoken much since they left the forest. The deep scratches on her arms had been bandaged, and her once wild hair had been combed back. But no one could erase the trauma that clearly weighed on her small, fragile shoulders. As they approached the building, Adam's heart raced. How could he explain everything to the authorities? Would they understand? Would they take her away? He had only known Vivien for a short while, but something about the connection between them felt unbreakable, like she had silently latched onto a part of his soul. Adam parked the car and, with a deep breath, turned to her. "We're here," he said softly. "It's going to be okay." Vivien's eyes flicked towards him briefly but remained distant. She stepped out of the car, her movements slow and hesitant. As they walked into the building, Adam couldn't shake the growing sense of dread in his chest. Inside, the sterile smell of polished floors and paperwork hung in the air. A stern-faced woman at the front desk raised an eyebrow as they approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice professional but impersonal. Adam cleared his throat. We found this girl. Her name's Vivien, and I think she needs help. She's been through something terrible." The woman's eyes softened slightly as she glanced at Vivien, then picked up a phone to call someone. Within minutes, 2 officials arrived, their expressions more serious. They asked Adam to recount what had happened, and as he spoke, the weight of the situation settled further into his chest. He felt like he was giving her away, like the fragile bond they had begun to form would be severed the moment he handed her over. The officials listened intently, exchanging glances. After his explanation, one of them knelt down to Vivien's level and spoke softly. "Vivien, we're going to help you. We're here to make sure you're safe." Vivien didn't respond. Her eyes flicked toward Adam for just a second, a brief flash of something, fear, trust, before they returned to the floor. They escorted her away, and Adam stood frozen, watching as the girl he'd grown attached to disappeared into a back room. His heart ached, his stomach twisted with guilt. He knew this was the right thing to do. She needed professionals to help her. But why did it feel so wrong? A few days passed. Adam and his wife, Ava, couldn't stop thinking about Vivien. Every night they'd lie awake talking about her. Ava, ever the practical one, suggested they visit. "We should check on her," she said, "just to see how she's doing." Adam didn't need convincing. The next day they returned to the agency, where they were informed that Vivien was under the care of child psychologists, slowly processing her trauma. Each time they visited, Adam felt his attachment to her grow stronger. Vivien, still quiet and withdrawn, began to open up, just a little, whenever she saw them. One afternoon, the news hit Adam like a punch to the gut. The agency planned to transfer Vivien to an orphanage where she would wait for someone to adopt her. The thought of Vivien, alone again, waiting in a system that might never give her the family she deserved, crushed him. "That's it," Adam muttered to Eva one evening. "We can't let them take her." Eva looked at him, her eyes mirroring his feelings. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we adopt her," She's already a part of us. Eva was silent for a moment, her eyes filling with emotion. Then she nodded. Let's do it. The decision wasn't easy. There were meetings, interviews, and legal procedures that seemed endless. But in the end, the agency approved them. And when they finally brought Vivien home, the small, timid girl who had once stared out at the world with fear looked at them with a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Adam knew at that moment that this was more than just the right thing to do. It was fate. Adam's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as they neared the town's government building. His eyes flickered towards Vivien, who sat silently in the passenger seat, her eyes blank, staring out the window at the passing scenery. She hadn't spoken much since they left the forest. The deep scratches on her arms had been bandaged, and her once wild hair had been combed back. But no one could erase the trauma that clearly weighed on her small, fragile shoulders. As they approached the building, Adam's heart raced. How could he explain everything to the authorities? Would they understand? Would they take her away? He had only known Vivien for a short while, but something about the connection between them felt unbreakable, like she had silently latched onto a part of his soul. Adam parked the car and, with a deep breath, turned to her. "We're here," he said softly. "It's going to be okay." Vivien's eyes flicked towards him briefly, but remained distant. She stepped out of the car, her movements slow and hesitant. As they walked into the building, Adam couldn't shake the growing sense of dread in his chest. Inside, the sterile smell of polished floors and paperwork hung in the air. A stern-faced woman at the front desk raised an eyebrow as they approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice professional but impersonal. Adam cleared his throat. We found this girl. Her name's Vivien, and I think she needs help. She's been through something terrible." The woman's eyes softened slightly as she glanced at Vivien, then picked up a phone to call someone. Within minutes, 2 officials arrived, their expressions more serious. They asked Adam to recount what had happened, and as he spoke, the weight of the situation settled further into his chest. The officials listened intently, exchanging glances. After his explanation, one of them knelt down to Vivien's level and spoke softly. "Vivien, we're going to help you. We're here to make sure you're safe." Vivien didn't respond. Her eyes flicked toward Adam for just a second, a brief flash of something, fear, trust, before they returned to the floor. He knew this was the right thing to do. She needed professionals to help her. But why did it feel so wrong? A few days passed. Adam and his wife Ava couldn't stop thinking about Vivien. Every night they'd lie awake talking about her. Ava, ever the practical one, suggested they visit. "We should check on her," she said, "just to see how she's doing." Adam didn't need convincing. The next day they returned to the agency, where they were informed that Vivien was under the care of child psychologists, slowly processing her trauma. Each time they visited, Adam felt his attachment to her grow stronger. Vivien, still quiet and withdrawn, began to open up, just a little, whenever she saw them. One afternoon, the news hit Adam like a punch to the gut. The agency planned to transfer Vivien to an orphanage, where she would wait for someone to adopt her. The thought of Vivien, alone again, waiting in a system that might never give her the family she deserved, crushed him. "That's it," Adam muttered to Ava one evening. "We can't let them take her." Ava looked at him, her eyes mirroring his feelings. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we adopt her. She's already a part of us." Ava was silent for a moment, her eyes filling with emotion. Then she nodded. "Let's do it." The decision wasn't easy. There were meetings, interviews, and legal procedures that seemed endless. But in the end, the agency approved them. And when they finally brought Vivien home, the small, timid girl who had once stared out at the world with fear looked at them with a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Adam knew at that moment that this was more than just the right thing to do. It was fate. The forest had an eerie quietness to it, the kind that made every crunch of fallen leaves underfoot seem louder. Vivien walked slowly, her eyes tracing the familiar path leading to the old house. It had been years since she last set foot here, but the memories, both warm and cold, flooded back as if no time had passed at all. Adam walked beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, offering silent support. His wife, Sarah, followed closely behind, giving the young girl space, but always near enough to step in if needed. This moment was Vivien's, and they knew she needed to take the lead. The house stood before them, its once vibrant walls now weathered and cracked. Vines crawled up its sides like veins, feeding off the remnants of a place long forgotten by the world, but not by Vivien. She took a deep breath, her small frame shivering, though the air was still and warm. "This is it," she whispered, almost to herself. Adam crouched down next to her, his voice low but firm. "Are you ready, Vivien?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving the house. It felt strange being here, knowing her mother would never answer the door again, never sit on the porch with her. For so long, this place had been her world, both sanctuary and prison. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small bouquet of wildflowers. The colors were bright, vibrant, a sharp contrast to the faded and crumbling structure before them. She walked slowly toward the front steps, each step heavier than the last. "I'm saying goodbye now," Vivien murmured as she knelt by the entrance. Her voice wavered, but she held herself steady. "I know. You wanted more for me. I know you tried. And now I found them. A family. A real one." She laid the flowers gently by the door, the final gesture of her farewell. The silence around her was thick, but inside she felt something shifting, breaking free. The weight she had carried for so long didn't feel so crushing anymore. "I hope you're okay wherever you are," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you know I'll be okay too." Adam and Sarah watched from a distance, giving her the space she needed. This moment wasn't just about the past. It was about closing a chapter and opening a new one. They had both agreed from the beginning that Vivien's healing needed to happen at her own pace, and today they were proud to witness this step. When Vivien finally stood up, she turned to face them. There were no tears in her eyes, just a calmness that hadn't been there before. She looked at Adam, then Sarah, and gave a small, uncertain smile. "I'm ready," she said, her voice stronger now. "I think it's time to go." Adam nodded, offering her his hand. She took it without hesitation, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. Sarah moved closer, wrapping an arm around Vivien's shoulders as they began to walk away from the house. The trees swayed gently above them, as if whispering their own goodbyes. The house, now fading into the background, became less of a monument to the past and more of a memory. And as the three of them moved further from the house and deeper into the forest, Vivien realized she didn't need to look back. She had always thought leaving this place would be the hardest thing she'd ever do. But now, with Adam and Sarah beside her, it felt like the natural next step. She wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to be. They reached the edge of the forest, where the light filtered through the trees, casting soft rays on the path ahead. The road they were on was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, Vivien felt ready to face it. Together, they walked hand in hand, leaving the shadows of the forest behind them, stepping into the light of something new. A future that was theirs to shape, with hope guiding each step forward. Vivien stood by the window, watching the sun dip behind the trees as the sky turned a gentle shade of pink. In the quiet warmth of the house, she felt something unfamiliar. Peace. It was a fragile feeling, one she hadn't known for a long time. She glanced over at the living room where Adam was sitting with his wife, Emily, who was knitting by the fire. They weren't doing anything extraordinary, but the simplicity of the scene filled her with a sense of calm. Adam noticed her lingering by the window and smiled, beckoning her over. "Hey, Vivien, come sit with us," he said, his voice soft and welcoming. It had been months since she first came to live with them, and things were slowly changing. Vivien hesitated for a moment, unsure. She still hadn't completely adjusted to calling this place home, but something about Adam's smile made her feel safe. She walked over and sat beside him. He put his arm around her in a way that felt natural, not forced, and she found herself leaning into him slightly. Emily looked up from her knitting. "You know, we've been thinking," she began, her tone gentle as always. "Maybe this weekend we could go for a walk by the lake. It's beautiful there this time of year." Vivien nodded, not looking up. She wasn't used to being included in plans like this, but the thought of going somewhere with them, just the three of them, filled her with a quiet kind of joy. "Would you like that?" Adam asked, his eyes searching hers. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. But they both heard it. The days had begun to feel more stable, more like something she could rely on. Every morning there was breakfast together. Every evening Adam or Emily would ask her how her day was. It wasn't grand gestures or big moments. It was the small, steady acts of care that were starting to break through the walls she had built around herself. One evening, after dinner, Adam took out an old photo album. "Let me show you something," he said, flipping through the pages. Pictures of vacations, birthdays, and family gatherings filled the book. "This was when Emily and I first moved into the house," he pointed to a picture of them. Younger, laughing with their arms around each other. "We've always loved this place." Vivien studied the photos carefully, feeling like she was being invited into a world she had never been a part of. The life they had built together was rich with memories, and now, it seemed, they wanted to create new ones with her. "Maybe we could take some pictures this weekend too," Emily suggested, her voice carrying an ease that made Vivien feel included rather than obligated. The walk by the lake came as planned. The air was crisp but not cold, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot accompanied their soft conversations. For the first time in a long while, Vivien found herself laughing, really laughing, at one of Adam's silly jokes. Emily took a picture of them by the water, capturing the moment. Later that evening, as they sat around the dinner table, something shifted in Vivien. She looked up from her plate and quietly said, "Can I call you Mom and Dad?" The words hung in the air for a moment, fragile and full of meaning. Adam and Emily exchanged a glance, their eyes softening. Emily reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Vivien's. "Of course, sweetheart. We'd love that." In that simple exchange, something inside Vivien broke free. She wasn't just a visitor in their home anymore. She was a part of it, of them. The sense of belonging she had longed for but never dared to hope for was finally within reach. As the weeks went on, Vivien found herself growing closer to both Adam and Emily. They began to build new routines together, small traditions that marked the passing of time, morning walks in the park, Sunday afternoon picnics, and evenings spent around the fire telling stories. The house, which had once seemed so unfamiliar, now felt like a real home. Every room held echoes of laughter, shared moments, and quiet conversations. And with each passing day, Vivien's heart opened a little more. The life she had before might have been filled with uncertainty, but now, in this small corner of the world, she had found something solid, something she could trust. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this new family, her family, would be there for her, no matter what. Together they walked out into the world, the three of them, hand in hand, stepping into a future that, for the first time in a long while, felt bright and full of promise. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but they also knew that no matter what, they would face them together, stronger as a family, bound by love, and ready for whatever came next.